Okay, so let's specifically look at the baroreceptors and how they work. Okay, so if we have our little heart, here's our little heart, here's our little aorta, and we've got some vessels coming out of the aorta here. They're going up into the head. Okay. And up in here, we've got little areas that contain these receptors. So we've got baroreceptors in these large arteries and in the aorta there. So this is the arch of aorta. This is the carotid sinus. Carotid sinuses. Okay, so these receptors are linked to neurons that take information about the stretch of these vessels back to the cardiac center in the medulla. So we're going to look at the blood pressure. We're going to look at the action potential and the response. Okay. Excuse me. Okay, so if I go over here and kind of draw my little, it's a terrible picture. It looks like an adrenal gland, but it's not. Okay, so we'll call this the medulla. Terrible picture, but use your imagination. So this thing in the middle is, we'll call that the cardiac center. So over here, I'm going to blow up my little baroreceptors. So these are the ones that are in the carotid sinus and the aortic arch. Okay. And from these guys, they are going to send action potentials based on the stretch of these vessels. So here and here, back to the cardiac center. So these are the baroreceptors. And again, this is the cardiac center. And the vessels are innervated specifically, we know, by the sympathetic nervous system. And basically what's happening is these vessels are sending information about what's going on back to the cardiac center. And it does that through a number of action potentials. So it's going to send action potentials based on the stretch it's feeling. So if it's feeling a lot of stretch, it's going to be sending a lot of action potentials. If it's feeling no stretch or little stretch, it's going to be sending fewer action potentials. Okay? So if a blood pressure is normal, let's just say the number of action potentials sent when the blood pressure is normal is 10 action potentials. What would be the response from the cardiac center if it's feeling 10 action potentials? There would be no response. Everything's fine. Everything's good. Everything's normal. Okay? If let's say we're feeling increased pressure, that means it's going to have increased stretch. So let's say that it's now sending 30 action potentials back to the cardiac center. So if there's 30 action potentials, that means blood pressure is up. Who will provide the response? The parasympathetic nervous system. I'm going to erase this right here. Okay. Let's say the number of action potentials is down. The blood pressure is down. So the number of action potentials, let's say, is 7. Who responds? The response would be sympathetic. Okay. Now I just said that the sympathetic nervous system is what innervates blood vessels. So that's going to be basically certain things are going to have to happen in order for the sympathetics to increase or decrease or increase blood pressure and for the parasympathetics to decrease blood pressure. Okay. All right. So in the ANS, we have the sympathetic response and the parasympathetic response. Okay, so both of these can affect the heart. The parasympathetics innervate the heart just like the sympathetics do, so the heart is different. And what happens? Well, when pressure is down and the sympathetics want to start increasing pressure, it can increase heart rate and increase stroke volume. Okay, that's an effect on the heart. The parasympathetics, if there's too high a blood pressure, it can do the opposite. It can lower heart rate and lower stroke volume. Okay, so this is a heart thing. The parasympathetics have innervation to the heart. Okay. Vessel-wise, if we look at the vessels, what can the sympathetics do? Well, the sympathetics innervate the vessels anyway. So they are going to, the sympathetic system is going to stimulate vasoconstriction by sending more action potentials. That's increasing resistance. So it sends more action potentials to the vessels, making them constrict. The parasympathetics will cause vasodilation. to decrease the resistance. But how does it do that? Because it does not have innervation to those vessels. And it does that by sending a chemical called nitric oxide. And nitric oxide is a vasodilator. Dilator, cannot spell. So the homeostasis of blood pressure is a result, as far as the baroreceptors go, which is assessing the stretch in those arteries, the aorta and the carotid sinus, and sending those information about the stretch of those vessels into or to the cardiac center. The cardiac center then through the sympathetics and parasympathetics will either increase or decrease heart rate depending on whether pressure, depending on whether it's too low or too high. And on the heart, they both do the exact thing, just the exact opposite thing, because they both have innervation to the heart. But vessels, they do not both, only the sympathetics. So the sympathetics will send more action potentials to the vessels, causing vasoconstriction, while the parasympathetics will send a chemical that is a vasodilator that will dilate the vessels. All right, so that's about it for blood pressure. So next we're going to talk about tissue perfusion.